These are Jesus' words. These are Jesus' commandments to speak up for, to advocate on behalf of, to defend the vulnerable. Isn't this what he's doing in the gospel today? This widow who gave everything she had to the treasury in the temple was, in essence, throwing herself on the mercy of the religious authorities, whose responsibility it was to look after orphans and widows and strangers and aliens and the vulnerable in the land. And Jesus condemned the religious authorities for their failure to do just that. And Jesus commended the widow for putting herself in a position of vulnerability and calling out the injustice of the powers that be. For me, this is a really hard time. Emotionally, I'm a wreck. I don't want to preach from that place. I think we have work to do. I want to preach from a position of authority. The authority of Scripture. The authority of our Savior, who gives us a task to do. I suspect that one of the reasons why so many people could line up behind Donald Trump was because they didn't connect the stories of those vulnerable people, who they know or who they are, with the danger that is posed. There's a disconnect. So our job is to make the connection and to stand up for the vulnerable and to tell their stories, to make sure that they're heard. Like Jesus, to put a spotlight on their experience. Because if we don't, what's going to happen? They're going to suffer more. We're going to suffer more. And the condemnation will be on us. So, I'm sorry this is heavy stuff, but I think that's where I'm at right now. And I hope and pray that God will give us the strength to do what we need to do. To speak up, to stand up for the vulnerable, to call our Congress people and our leaders, and to say, it's not okay with me if you do away with the pre-existing condition clause in the because that's going to hurt a lot of people. It's not okay with me if you rescind protections for LGBTQ people, because that's going to hurt my neighbor, my friend, my priest. It's not okay with me if you require transgender people to use a restroom that they don't identify with. It's not okay with me. That's the message that we need to be clear about. If they don't hear from us, they're going to think it's all good. They're going to line up behind the bigotry and the racism and the homophobia and the transphobia. We need to be clear about what our role is, and I think Jesus helps us today in the gospel by shining a light on this vulnerable person and condemning the powers that be that create the circumstances that lead to her devastation. So that's the good